Let me introduce from our far right, he's been up before, Grant King, President of the BCA. I reckon if there was a thinker in residence that would be worthwhile considering in Adelaide, it would be Grant. He's a man with a very, very big brain and a big man in the gas industry, former MD at Origin. To Grant's left, we've got Guy Templeton, President and CEO of Australia New Zealand for WSP. Now, Guy leads WSP here. It's a global professional services engineering firm employing, I think, almost 50,000 people, designing and connecting the cities of tomorrow. He's been Chief Executive at Minter Ellison Law Firm and Managing Partner at PA Consulting, and he's been busy doing water and wastewater projects around Adelaide. Mark Hand, next one, is our big banker, Group Executive of Retail and Commercial Banking at ANZ. We should say that proudly. You do. We should say that proudly. We need you. Responsible for, 6 million customers across retail, business and private banking. 30 years of experience at ANZ, and Mark's had senior roles in Australia and South Asia. He's also chair of the Banking Association's Strategy Committee and Consumer Outcomes Group. Then there's Professor David... then there's Jennifer, yes, who you all know very well. I should just add, Jennifer's, this has been a passion of yours, hasn't it, Jennifer, in the last few years, this plan for Strong Australia. Jennifer has, though, worked both in the public and the private sector, a partner at KPMG, and you did the 30-year plan for Adelaide in 2010, so just the right sort of person to drive this. Professor David Lloyd. David is Vice-Chancellor and President of the University of South Australia. Many of you may well know him, which is positioning as Australia's University of Enterprise. Dublin-born and educated chemist. He's recently just done 4 years on the board of the SA Economic Development Board. Now on the board of Universities Australia, where he's lead Vice-Chancellor for Research and Innovation, and he's the Director of the ARC Advisory Council. And then to my immediate right, Ian Smith, who I've known for years and years. He's Deputy Chair of the Committee for Adelaide. He's got a Rolodex to die for. Former CEO of Gavin Anderson, advisor to the former state Liberal Party leaders and consultants to governments. He knows everything about all the big M&A deals that are going on in Australia. I would say almost every single one. Anyway, so please join me in thanking our panel. All right, well, let's kick off. I'll go to Jennifer first. Jennifer, you talked about this as a year of choices for everyone. Adelaide in particular, you're coming back to a second time now. I'm thinking that there's a lot of upside and opportunity in Adelaide.
It's interesting, there's a lot of positive energy in Adelaide now, and I think across the state. I mean, I always take a sort of crane-ometer of how many cranes are in the air. And there's a lot of cranes here at the moment. And they're not all public sector cranes. It's not all the taxpayers' money. And so that tells you something is happening. And I think, to me, South Australia is a great sort of case study of when the country works, South Australia thrives. If the country does not work, if the economy starts to falter, places like South Australia, which don't have many huge businesses here, they've got to work hard for their comparative advantages. It just is so much harder if the economy is weaker.
Ian, what's been happening in Adelaide, though, in recent times? I mean, people have been leaving Adelaide.
Yeah, I mean, Adelaide has lost people for quite a few decades now, particularly young people, and it's linked clearly, and here we are with the BCA, to big businesses leaving too, and I think that's something we've really got to take on board, because while we have some wonderful small and medium-sized enterprises, the fact that I think in the BCA's book there's one Adelaide company headquartered, or one company...
Well, Santos, yeah.
In Santos here amongst the BCA, and that used to look down North Terrace. There was Forwardings, News Corp, South Corp, Adsteam, a whole range of these businesses. So, but saying that, there is a real sense now of a bit of a sort of turnaround. I was just talking to Brendan Rinaldi here from ANZ, and he was just saying, you know, I was saying, you can't leave this place, mate, you're too good to stay here. And he was telling me how his wife says, no, we're not going anywhere.
Yes.
Now, that's important.
And that's a quality of life thing.
That's a quality of life thing. So you've got young executives wanting to stay here, young executives who actually can travel from here irrespective of the job in the organisation. Many people do. And I mean, everyone, you know, who's most probably in this room based in Adelaide travels a lot.
Yeah.
And
so when we've got in Sydney and in Melbourne, we've got problems with congestion and issues about numbers, and you know, it's full. Sydney, we hear. You've got this advantage here, but perhaps I could bring in our banker now. Mark, does the investment case for Adelaide stack up?
I think it does. We've been to similar discussions in Mount Gambier about how you convince people that the Great Ocean Road doesn't end in Victoria and they track people to their city. We've had conversations like this in Newcastle. I even had it years ago in Seattle, where they're trying to work out if 40 million people go to California or to Los Angeles, why can't we just get another 3 million people to visit us? So it's the same problem that everyone's trying to solve for. You need to attract you need people, you need investment, you need facilities. And we had a conversation earlier about, is it a case of if you build it, they will come?
Yes. Sometimes
the investment case doesn't stack up. You need to put money towards reasons for people to move here, to live here, to want to work here. It's an attractive place to work. I agree. The congestion, I live in Melbourne. I travel to Sydney a lot, and the congestion is painful. The only painful thing I found here this morning was walking to find a good coffee. I did find one, but walking to find a good coffee, I nearly tripped over. I was watching my phone. I nearly tripped over about 5 times because I kept standing in construction sites. And I absolutely agree. I've never seen it like that to that scale in Adelaide before. I think you've got to have faith.
Does that affect somebody like you as a banker when you see this sort of activity going on? Because ANZ has quite a presence here. I mean, you have closed a couple of branches in recent times, but does that make you think, hey, maybe we should take a deeper look?
It absolutely does. The craneometer, we run truckometers in New Zealand, and these sorts of things are quite key inputs to our thinking about the vibrancy of a place that we're in, and it absolutely has an impact when you can physically see the investment. We have one branch for every 25,000 people in South Australia. The rest of the country, it's about one branch for every 37 to 40,000 people. One of the reasons we've got more branches here is because we've actually got more business. We've got, particularly in regional South Australia, higher scale, and we're seeing quite good volumes, more so than in other parts of the country.
Yeah. So what puts you off, apart from, well, I guess there's a state levy that could always put you off?
Yeah, that was great. That was a really attractive way to want us to come and invest in this state.
But that was a big call, you making that stand against the former state government, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was a big call. And interestingly, our Chief Executive, Shane Elliott, came over and met with the Premier at the time. And the Premier said it's the first time he's ever met one of the Big Four bank CEOs. Mm-hmm. And we found that surprising that the CEOs or that community effectively hadn't invested significant time here. I think that opened a different dialogue with the government and obviously future governments than what we'd had before. So it was probably a pivotal point.
Yes, Grant, come in. Right.
No,
okay.
Fascinated with the conversation.
Well, let me bring David in for a moment. We're just talking about the amount of investment in Adelaide. Now, there has been a huge amount, particularly on the defence front. We're hearing a lot of investment on the infrastructure front. Is it a bit of a tipping point now as to how that is used, and then hopefully there's traction?
Yeah, well, I guess the answer to the question is we hope so. I think I've been here now 7 years, and in 7 years we've seen probably $3 billion worth of infrastructure go up along North Terrace. At the same time, nationally, I've seen 7 prime ministers. So there's a combination of stability and instability and investment. From a defence standpoint, you've got $90 billion of a $200 billion investment being spent in the state. And if we can't capitalise on that, I think we should be told to go home and we can close the doors. How we deliver that is about skills and it's about infrastructure and an enabling basis. I think we are behind on skills delivery. I think that the primes who are going to deliver this wonderful piece of defence infrastructure and sovereign capability have needs right now that we're going to struggle to deliver. But I'm, like everybody else who lives here, I'm incredibly optimistic about the state. And in terms of a sentiment analysis, I used a craneometer for someone who went through the crash that happened in Ireland. It can be a worry, but when it's private sector cranes and not public money, it becomes certainly it's more of a comfort. In terms of the vibrancy of the city, you look at the international student population, our numbers are up in high double digits in terms of increases year on year in international students, and it's not single economy reliance, so we're seeing diversity of students. And there's an increased, I think, attraction to the innovation economy in the context of South Australia around areas like Lot 14, where you get collaboration, public and private, with the space agency being located right here. Lot 14, for those who don't know, is a rebranded development of the old Royal Adelaide Hospital site, which I think by definition that makes the University of Adelaide Lot 13, because it's next door. Yeah, that's a private South Australian joke. Lot 14 is going to become an innovation and, I suppose, co-working collaboration space. It's anchored around high-tech industries and growth, and right now it's where the space agency will be located for Australia. So it's bringing a new sectoral focus into the city, which again will actually, space, and nothing inspires like space. There was more airtime on the television this morning about a black hole photograph than there was about Brexit.
Guy, let me bring you in here. In terms of the attraction of Adelaide and some of the challenges of Adelaide, perhaps.
So I think the attraction of Adelaide is that there is quite a lot moving around infrastructure and investment now. So the state's putting in about $11 billion over 4 years. We're involved in planning the north-south corridor, so that's $5.4 billion. And what's encouraging for us is there's bipartisan support around a lot of this investment. So what we get worried about is when we see government policies which are quite different between the parties around things which is a basic infrastructure which will enable the sorts of developments that David's talking about. So it's going to be very hard to invest $90 billion in defence without the right road, rail, education, etc. Yeah.
Jennifer, one of the things you talk about in your plan today is trigger points and also cost-benefit analysis of infrastructure.
Yeah, so one of the things we've heard around the countries we've got around to all parts of Australia is that there's really essential infrastructure, whether it's in Sydney or Melbourne, which we all know about, but places like Busselton that needs a new terminal, lots of infrastructure that we need here in South Australia. What people are frustrated by is the inability to predict it, and that we always play catch-up. And so by then, of course, particularly in our major cities, people are extremely irritated by then. So surely it's not too hard to say, let's put a trigger in so that when population reaches, or we can see the population reaching a certain amount, we know that we've got to be spending this amount. Now, that doesn't have to all be public. In fact, we would encourage that to be more private. We need this kind of pipeline of projects, and we will need these bits of critical public infrastructure, an airport, a different rail link and so on, and that will be different. Now, we would like Infrastructure Australia to start planning on that basis rather than what I think happens a bit at the moment, which is they get a list of projects from each state. On the cost-benefit analysis, look, I always make a joke, the Harbour Bridge wouldn't have passed a cost-benefit analysis, and it wouldn't have. So we've got to find a way of making sure that we don't waste money, that we don't spend either the public or private sector's money in the wrong way, but really there's got to be a different way of valuing the strategic role of regions, the strategic infrastructure that keeps them going, the strategic investment, and do it from a bit of a ground up. So we're saying get a trigger. I'm always amazed we've got a trigger of how many politicians we need when the population grows. Surely we can get one for how much infrastructure we need. And then the kind of planning of what has to be more ground up, I think. And less, you've got to have the kind of rigour. You don't want to waste money But you've got to say, look, these are strategically important parts of our
I was going to
country.
say, Grant, we've got Tony Shepherd now, who's going to be running this, or is running the infrastructure, South Australian infrastructure body. Now, he's about as dry as you can get in terms of cost-benefit analysis. What would he think of throwing in, looking at benefit in a different way, perhaps?
Well, I think firstly Tony's very well trained because he also served as the president of the BCA a couple of years ago and worked with Jennifer, so I'd be surprised if there was a huge divergence between their views. Look, Tony, you talk about dry, and I suspect you're going back to the Commission of Audit and the period of time when that occurred. And I think Jennifer makes a good point. I mean, most times it is important to be objective, evidence-based, analytical about the decisions we make, particularly when public funds have been committed. Mm-hmm. But we also need to be thoughtful enough to understand there are other benefits that we need to be smart enough to value as well. And I think the point that Jennifer makes about investment in regional communities and the value of thriving, vibrant regional communities to Australia is very, very important. And I think Tony understands that as well. He took on Great Western Sydney in the AFL, so at the end of the day that might not have passed a cost-benefit analysis to begin with, but they're doing very well. So I'm sure Tony will make a great contribution.
Over in the east, but anyway.
Yeah.
Grant, while I've got you there, electricity. Prices in this state, we hear, are among the highest in the world. You're the energy man. What should we be doing?
Well, if you could excuse the expression, but in some respects South Australia's been the canary in the coal mine because there was a real-time experiment conducted in very high levels of renewable, intermittent energy in a system with very weak interconnectors. Now, it's a very technical explanation with the rest of Australia. But it isn't just a South Australian problem. All of Australia is seeing the consequence of some very poor decisions. In fact, 10 years of bad policy decisions. And having asked the question, if I give you a quick analysis, and it's not, many people have done a sort of detailed technical analysis of why we've got to where we've got to. High prices, unacceptably low, reliability that's not at the standard it should be. And in my view, there are two root causes. One is a lack of political bipartisanship. And Guy made the point very well that where you don't get consistency, you don't get investment. And so this could possibly be the fifth election we're going to go into where we've got bidding at either end of the extremes on climate and energy policies. And that lack of consistency, will we or won't we have a carbon price? Will we have high targets or low targets? Will we have subsidies or no subsidies? Whenever we've made a decision,
but is it possible just to cut through and just say, actually, for now, the best thing for Adelaide and South Australia is what? Yeah.
So to take that through, because I know you want to cut through, so that, first of all, we've got to stop that. We've got to get some bipartisan support for a policy that people can rely on. And the second is the desire to grab the next big thing, the next big idea, with no evidence, no factual analysis. And we've seen a series of these poor decisions made. That's led to the problem. The quick fix is harder to answer because you don't turn around 10 years of poor policy and fix things in 12 months. But there are things that can be done sooner rather than later. We had two very well-informed inquiries, both by Finkel and by the ACCC. I think in total 106 recommendations. Many of those go to price and reliability. Many of them have not been implemented and could be relatively simply implemented. So that's the very first thing you could do, is just implement some of those recommendations. And those recommendations, and let me take a practical example for South Australia. A live consideration at the moment is whether the interconnector with New South Wales is built. So a mitigant to intermittency in South Australia is build more generation in South Australia or connect South Australia with stronger links to the national grid. The tests that exist in our system to decide whether that's a good thing take a long time to run. They could be run more quickly. So there are things that could be done to more quickly improve the situation, but it would be misleading to say to the community that it will be fixed in 12 months.
Anyone else want to jump in there?
I think we've tried to outline in the plan some practical things you could do. One goes to the issue that Grant went through, which is in the medium term. In the short term, you could do some things like change the way bills are given to customers, which is called a reference bill without going into the technicality, which gives consumers greater choice. You could really take the advice of getting rid of some of the so-called green schemes, which have added 15% to people's bills, where we're subsidising things that now can stand on their own. In the medium term, you've got to get investment back. You've got to get it into dispatchable or baseload power. You've got to unleash these silly moratoriums in New South Wales and Victoria on gas, which is, of course, 50% more efficient in terms of emissions. You've got to get these big projects, the interconnectors here, and also the interconnector from Tasmania, which, of course, was flush with hydropower during the hot summer, and of course, the mainland was struggling. And then you've got to get some sense of certainty on the climate policy and a proper transition. And we've put a fair bit of work into this in our plan about you've got to send a price signal, you've got to try and make sure the focus is on technology change.
Yeah.
You've got to be careful that you do not, at the same time, create such economic dislocation that you kind of have another false start. We cannot do another false start on climate policy. We've done it for a decade.
But given, as Grant says, this transition has been, very tough on South Australia, but once it's through and we're out the other side with battery power, shouldn't South Australia really have an opportunity to lead the nation on this? I was speaking with Sanjeev Gupta. Yes, all right, Guy. I was speaking with Sanjeev Gupta yesterday and asked him, was he going to build an electric vehicle in South Australia, thanks to Labor's announcement on some of its sort of research funding on EVs and its commitment out to 2030. And he, by the end of the interview, was saying absolutely. It was just a question of whether it was going to be the Holden plant here or maybe Victoria, and he was tossing it up. Now, imagine if we could restart car making in Adelaide. Is that out of the question?
Well, I think I was really going to say with SAP, what this means for South Australia is it puts South Australia on the map around energy policy. So in South Australia, 35% of power is from renewables. And what we see around the world is rather than Australia saying what's happening in the US or Europe, we're now getting a lot of inbound inquiries to say how are things working and how are things going in South Australia. And the number of Twitter followers that Elon Musk has been very positive for South Australia. So I think with electric vehicles, it's one thing about manufacturing them, but it's just another thing about reducing the carbon footprint of the country through adoption. And there it's about making electric vehicles available so people can exercise free choice in what sort of vehicle they have. Yeah. So I think having targets is a kind of a funny concept. This is really about having a market which operates freely and lets newer technologies be adopted at a rate that's appropriate.
I think with all of this just is to be very careful about how you do things. And like what we've tried to do in our document is give a bit more detail. There's huge questions about implementation, and I think what we can't do in our year of choices is to have another, we'll work it out later, because the last decade has proven we don't. And that we make these false starts by over-promising, by saying to people, there'll be no impact, we can do this, it won't have any cost. Let's be honest with the community about the cost of transition. We should do the transition, but the idea that you don't have to make a set of decisions, that you don't have to think through the detail, that you don't have to think about the sectoral effects, and that you don't have to think about the fact that while people are part of an experiment, they're paying more for their power. And small business is hurting because of that. So you've got to think this through. And so when I hear people say, we're going to do this by X time, you think, okay, how? Now let's manage the transition so that if you said to somebody out there today who's dreading their summer electricity bill, they are terrified of it. Look, haven't you been part of this fantastic world experiment? I know what they'd say.
So, all right, well, let me bring both David and Ian in together now, because one of the things that strikes me about South Australia, and Adelaide in particular, is that you've got this massive investment in defence. You're looking at IT hubs and really not just the Navy and the Army, but supply chains, and trying to upskill a real hub here in South Australia, subsidised. Is this going to happen?
It can happen. I think there's a few policy levers that need to be pulled to make it happen in a timely fashion. It's not the irony of a cap on university places at a time when we're being asked to produce more engineers is never lost on me.
So just unpack that for me.
In 2017, the demand-driven system, which is the pinnacle of participation in higher education for the whole nation, was frozen by the government on a cost basis, where they decided that it was okay for 60% of people not to attend university, that 40% was enough. Now, in South Australia, it's 31% of 15 to 24-year-olds going to higher education. In Queensland, it's 28%, right? So the participation rates are pretty low. But it was okay because in the ACT it's in the high 50s and in metropolitan Sydney it's in the 60s. But if the one-size-fits-all policy was we will cap places, which meant that in costs, in high-cost production areas, like producing an engineer is a pretty intense outlay for any institution, because there's a lot of placements, there's a lot of training, and it's a long program. The student pays a contribution to that, which is the way the demand-driven system works, and they pay their HEX component. The CGS component is frozen, so it's gone. Every single graduate that we produce over our 2017 numbers is a loss leader, and in engineering we lose about 25 grand per engineer that goes out the door over our 2017 numbers, at a time when BAE and Raytheon and Saab
What
and
would
Naval...
you like to see?
Well, I want to see a return to a funded education system which enables people to make choice and expend their revenue, which is the HEX side of the hand, in tandem with the government's revenue, which is CGS, to deliver education. It's the cap limits participation, which I think limits choice and limits ambition. And if we're going to produce 5,000 new engineers and each one is going to lose 25 grand as we produce them, they're not going to be produced.
All right. Ian, what's your view on the ability to kickstart South Australia through huge investment? And if we have a shortened government, how is South Australia going to fare? Because we've got a Liberal state leadership and we've got an awful lot of sitting federal Liberal members.
Well, with my unrivalled Labor pedigree, I'm perfectly positioned to answer that question. Look, I actually think, just go back a step to the previous question, and I think we have to sort of be, continually sort of be honest in South Australia. I mean, we can become complacent through subsidies, and we have had submarines, shipbuilding. There could well be a MFP. That was wonderful. But I think, we've got some great things happening here. It's what the private sector can get going around those wonderful subsidised enterprises we've got going on. So to see someone like Sanjeev Gupta look at electric cars, it's not going to happen without government assistance of some sort, and I think that augurs well. But it's got to be driven by the private sector. It's to Jennifer's point. It's got to be proven up, and it's got to, governments can't make decisions and say we're going to do this by this time without understanding what those barriers are and those barriers to entry for the private sector. So, look, I think tremendous opportunity exists here. It's interesting, we've got the Commissioner for Youth in the audience today, she does a wonderful job around sort of engaging with kids in our community, teenagers, young people, about what it is they want. And, they're wanting sort of, in a way, a sort of less regulated, an ability to sort of fulfil their dreams. Now, that sounds somewhat sort of pithy, but at the end of the day, what are the barriers to South Australia's growth? And we want to encourage people to live here. It really goes to a livability piece. We want to, when we're encouraging people coming in to join Naval Group out of France, they want to be able to come here and they want to be able to shop when they can shop. They want to go to shops that open on a Sunday morning and they don't have to queue for the supermarket to open, or the supermarket doesn't open because it's too big. I mean, preposterous things. At a national level, you can't even, we've got to look at the barriers that make this place livable, but particularly make Adelaide livable for people coming here. So there's the lifestyle piece here that I think we've really got to open our eyes up to. And I know, through the committee, we talk about, having a sustainable place for our people, for our businesses, and that really matters. We can talk about all sorts of things around, how is business going to drive, but how do individuals want to come and sort of live here?
So Mark, when you look at that livability side of things, and you look at the concerns of the property market, particularly what's happening in Sydney and Melbourne, contrast it with Adelaide and the current credit squeeze that's going on. I mean, how do you set Adelaide in that context?
No doubt it's a very livable place. We don't see, even our staff, we don't see lots of people wanting to migrate here because I just don't believe that the long-term jobs are there for them. I think the biggest problem, and it's been touched on by a few people, is this level of certainty. Our corporate customer base are less leveraged than they've ever been. They've got the lowest levels of debt. and they've been waiting for almost 5 years for reasons to invest. They've hated a minority government because they're uncertain about policy changes that are going to happen. The sooner we get some certainty about the way forward, I think we'll start to see investment. And if our corporate customers aren't investing, it means it's either got to be the government, because our small business customers don't invest unless the corporates are investing, because they feed off that and they create the jobs. We need to see some certainty, and a lot of our big customers say, we don't really care who's in government anymore. We just want to know what their clear policy is. We'd like them to have a mandate, a majority, to get some things through, and then we'll start to invest again.
Yeah. So does that come back down to big business having a presence?
I think it helps, but the Australian economy is so driven by small business, and increasingly so. I think we need big business to set the tone. If they've got the confidence and they start investing, the rest will come. I think Adelaide can thrive on the back of small business, but it needs that level of certainty, big business and government putting money into big projects.
And can you say, looking nationally, that it's easier or harder to get a mortgage or a small business loan in South Australia than it is in, say, New South Wales?
No, I don't think it's harder anywhere. It's hard everywhere.
Yeah.
It's a different world. I've been there 30 years, and it's never been harder to lend money. With just the expectations on the back of the Royal Commission of the steps with the processes we go through, it is harder and it takes longer to make these things happen. The credit's available, but it is a more difficult process to get hold of, and I think that is another aspect of the uncertainty that's making it harder for us to lend, and it's making it harder for customers to explain and justify why they want to borrow and invest.
Can I throw open to the floor? Would anybody else like to take this in a different direction or drill down a bit harder? There's roving mics here. Please don't be shy. Anything at all. Yes, sir.
We've not ever talked about water, yet it's one of the biggest problems we have in Australia for the outback, for the farmers and everything else. In South Australia, we haven't built a dam in, say, 50 or 60 years. We never discuss water as a major issue for infrastructure. And yet, we have all this water that comes down from the north and gets absolutely wasted.
That's true.
But no one ever addresses it.
Yeah. Can I put Guy onto this?
Sure. I think water in Australia has been neglected. It tends to be a lower expenditure right in a lot of the big transport projects. It becomes controversial around land use. One of the very important things is to get proper pricing into water, and then decent investment decisions will follow if we place an appropriate value upon it. The other issue with water, I think, is if we're looking at climatic change, the gaps between major deluges and droughts, they seem to be getting more extreme and often sort of further apart. So I think we need to be looking at the total amount of capacity and the connectivity between. We've had a number of Australian cities, Perth being an example, which started running very low. We've seen that in parts of Africa as well. We see it in California. And I think we need a more cohesive, better funded, better articulated water policy, but we do need to make sure we get a price signal in there in areas that's missing, in my view.
I think on top of that, you have to get the ideology out of this. We were in Townsville the week before last. They just had this terrible flood, shocking flood. 3,000 homes still unable to have families living in them. And 2 weeks before that, they were on water restrictions. And, there's a plan for a dam, but we as a country won't even have these conversations now. The whole question of storage, of the right sort of infrastructure, of investing in water, of accepting that you have to manage volatility through some kind of storage, it just bewilders me that we were not willing to have a conversation about environmentally appropriate water storage. It's just off the agenda. And then, of course, what were we trying to do with the Murray-Darling Basin stuff? Do we set an objective that was about outcomes or an objective about a certain gigalitres of water? I would have loved to have set sort of more about outcomes, an efficient irrigated agriculture system, certain environmental outcomes, which of course really feel the pain here in South Australia. So I think water policy, you're absolutely right, has been really, I think, captured by very, very strong ideological positions, and it is no solution to where we have to go.
And I just add to that the most important thing, as far as I'm concerned, is that the Murray-Darling Basin Plan doesn't change, because if it changes, it's not going to change in Adelaide's favour. No? So it was agreed. It took an awfully long time. I wrote a book about it to agree it, and that idea is really important. I mean, regardless of it could have been done better, maybe, but just to get all these cats to agree, and the to your question about JJC Bradfield and turning water around and everything else, I do think going to the cost-benefit analysis again, and particularly the power needed at the moment to move water, and also no one talks about salt these days. Not even people in Adelaide talk about salt anymore, which absolutely staggers me. I suppose it's because the water's not running at the moment, but that's another huge issue. You start bringing water in bulk down from one side of Australia to another, and all sorts of other problems happen. So to me, I'd be concentrating on those farmers on the Darling, put that water back. Anyway, anyone else got another?
Thank you for the nod, Ian. Look, I'm really interested in the sense of when we know we need to turn businesses around, we look to, I'm losing my voice, sorry, leadership and governance and culture. So if we're not going to attract big business into South Australia, do we have the culture piece here to drive innovation? Because it seems to be that a lot of the language is about us being an innovative entrepreneurial state. It's not the language of someone who spends their life with young people hears in them. What are those culture levers that we need to look to, I guess, to drive that for South Australia?
David and Ian are going to fight for this one.
Well, I think we come off a particularly good base when you look at our history. Now, I'm not sure how many of those young people are really deeply aware of that history. We've been a state of firsts on so many fronts. I've been talking to people recently here, including many from colleagues in the committee, around when you look at issues like race and welcoming migrants. I think we in many respects lead the nation. I mean, we have not seen the horrific and untrue allegations made against sections of the community in Victoria. We haven't seen issues that have cropped up in certain suburbs of Sydney. And there is a reason for that, because I think we are actually and genuinely can point to being a more welcoming part. And I think, culturally, this is going very local to those coming in from interstate, but I think we actually have to do a better job of recognising those strengths and portraying those strengths, and actually being more robust in how we almost advertise those. I think we can get big business here, actually. I think as big business looks to relocate, travel, ease of communications, etc., we're a perfect place. And we don't need many. We only need a handful, going back to the days when we had sort of a half dozen or so. I mean, it's interesting, and we're having a chat beforehand. I mean, I find it quite preposterous that, we've got those two pandas, but we have to get government funding to keep pandas here. You go to Melbourne Zoo or Taronga Zoo, there are all sorts of corporates supporting that sort of need. And I don't have a week that goes past without someone giving me the call from a arts organisation, sports organisation, whatever, saying, Ian, we've got to look at sponsorship. How can we do that? That feeds into youth as well. So, I think, not particularly answering your question directly, but I think the pillars in this state are absolutely fantastic. And the more, and we've had so many sort of campaigns, but it's not SA's great, and it's not sort of made in South Australia. It's about the fabric of this place that, makes people look over the border and say, that's where I want to live. So Mark, you've got Brendan, I was making earlier comments, who's with ANZ, who lives here and his wife doesn't want to leave. And you've got Mark saying he actually doesn't know many people who want to live here, but once they get here, they want to stay. So that's the bridge we've got to sort of couple, I think.
I can build as somebody who chose to come here and then chose to stay. From a cultural standpoint, I think one of the things we suffer from is this fixation on the next bright, shiny thing. And saying we're innovative or entrepreneurial is not the same thing as demonstrating we are innovative or entrepreneurial. And there's there's a 150-year history of innovation and entrepreneurship in this state, right? It's established. I mean, but it is still a very small business state. I think things like eliminating payroll tax will go away to see whether we can actually innovate to take small to medium, as people will actually increase employment, and because one of the barriers to expansion is complacency, and complacency from a position of comfort. Right? I have a tick-over habitual lifestyle which is satisfied by what I do, and I don't have the ambition to do more. So how do we celebrate the ambitious? How do we recognise the ambitious and de-risk some of their activities? Some of it's about putting in place the means for them to scale successfully. We partnered with ANZ in 2014, and it's gone on ever since around business growth in UniSA. And we scaled, and we're teaching businesses how to scale, to go from S to M and from M to slightly bigger than M. Right? Before they get to large, I think we need to have the intellectual resilience in our youth that says that it's okay to try things, it's okay to succeed, it's okay to fail. When we put opportunities in front of students to do innovation and entrepreneurship programs, it's only a tiny sliver will actually take it on. Because most of them are interested in getting their degree and getting a job. Right? And then it's whether we can actually raise their gaze to see that ambition pays off and celebrate ambition. So you take the Miriotas of the world and you bring them in and you show that you can scale a company from 0 to hundreds very, very quickly. You can engage in multinational collaborations, and you can engage in lead business from South Australia. One of the things next week that's going out is Game of Thrones comes back. Right?
Thank God.
Game of Thrones comes back on the 15th, and the special effects powerhouse that is Rising Sun Picture is all over that from Adelaide, right? So I mean, but that's invisible to so many of our youth. We'll be running ads talking about how UniSA graduates are providing the FX for Game of Thrones. They know what happens next. They've already seen the dailies, right? But that is a medium-sized enterprise that can grow and scale. Technicolor are coming here to bring the mill here for the same thing, for post-production rights. We have enterprises which are here, and then we have food and wine, right, which are our number one exports in the state. Soon to be overtaken by higher education. We'll be number one. But having said that, we need to actually celebrate those successes. And there are small artisan producers who are doing phenomenally well. And we have some big producers, the likes of Thomas Foods, who are doing phenomenally well. We don't celebrate success. We tend to look outside and not think about what we've got.
And Jennifer, that goes as well. That goes as well to reform, to tax reform,
Sure.
to things like your I've got a mental block. Your investment allowance thoughts and things like that.
Absolutely. Like, I wouldn't give up on big business. And also, you've got to make sure you keep the medium businesses. I mean, the three companies who were very, very supportive of lowering the tax rate, particularly Thomas Foods and Cooper's Brewery here in South Australia. I mean, they, as well as BHP and Rio Tinto, obviously. So I wouldn't give up on getting big business here, but you also make sure we keep the medium-sized businesses, who will, of course, go on to become big businesses. Look, tax matters. The senators decided to give up on that, but certainly giving people a investment allowance to depreciate investment gets this problem of the fact that we are in a stall on investment. And investment, just to be technical, as a share of GDP, is as low as it's been since the 1990s. Now that you've got to ask, what is going wrong there? So I think national reform matters for South Australia, because if you cannot get companies coming, and Mark's point's right, you need that big investment to pull through into the economy. And if you can't get companies coming to Australia, you can't get things happening in South Australia.
Yeah, Grant, do you want to chip in?
Well, thank you. You asked a question about culture. You asked a question earlier about opportunities in South Australia, and governments can play an important role here in the relationship between governments and businesses. So to give you 4 examples, clearly South Australia led the way on renewables. That's one example, a brave decision at the time. South Australia chose not to do what just about every other jurisdiction in Australia did, which was ban fracking in respect of accessing gas resources. It had the courage to go against the popular trend and make the right decision. South Australia is very brave in being the only state that I know of that actually had an inquiry into the use of nuclear power. Now, it didn't lead anywhere, but no other jurisdiction was willing to tackle that issue. And another example, I think South Australia is probably leading in respect of creating a regulatory environment for the use of autonomous vehicles. So you talk about electric vehicles, but autonomous vehicles are out there growing rapidly. So I think one of the great opportunities South Australia has, because it has less choices, it's less blessed perhaps than some of the other states, is to be brave.
Water recycling's another one.
Water, yeah. So South Australia has the opportunity to be brave and to create the environment for new businesses. It is in reality difficult. I don't think a company is going to relocate its head office from Sydney or Melbourne to Adelaide, to be realistic. But there are lots of opportunities for new businesses which will become the big businesses of the future.
Right.
And this is one of the great challenges for Australia. What are our next big businesses? And South Australia can help seed that by being willing to take on issues which other states blessed with choices sometimes are not willing to do so politically. And in so doing, they will create opportunities for South Australians.
We have another couple? Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, so over the past number of years, the funding to the vocational education and training sector has been significantly impacted, year on year it seems. And David's spoken very eloquently about the opportunities in the higher education sector. What's the panel's view in what should happen in the vocational education and training sector to really be sure that we have the tradespeople available to build the submarines and the frigates, but also more than that, to create the lifelong learning approach that Australia really needs if we're going to shift and move with the changes in the future of work?
Well, this goes to a central point of Jennifer's plan, isn't it? Future-proofing.
Yep. So it's a really good question. So, what we have said is, first of all, the status of vocational education has to be on the same footing as universities. And we've got this second-class citizen mentality that smart kids go to university and the other ones don't. We've got to end that as a country. Because how many kids do we all know who've gone off to uni, it's been a disaster, and then, they're unemployed or they take a long time to get a job? Number one. Number two, we need a national vision for VET, and we don't have one. Number three, what we've called for in our plan is a couple of really quite practical things. Why can't we have one information system that sits across higher education and TAFE that allows a young person or a worker to actually kind of see, well, that's the course, that's the subsidy, that's how much it's going to cost, that's the sort of job prospects that I might get. I can start making an informed choice. We've called for a thing called a lifelong skills account made up of a subsidy, in the HECS arrangements, and a income contingent loan. So putting the universities and TAFEs and private providers on the same funding principles, the same funding platform, and then off the back of that, a lifelong skills account. So that if I'm a worker who's 52, I can go and pick a module of something, and I can get that from a TAFE, I can get that from a private provider, I can get that from a uni. I can get another one, so I can supplement my micro-credentials and end up with a set of skills that make me able to stay in the workforce. And if we don't do that, our data last year showed something really very important. The less task change in your job, the more likely you were to lose it. And so if we don't start getting people ready, not just tradespeople, I mean, that's one thing I would love us to stop thinking about VET just as a tradies kind of thing. It's a really important sector that could do so much more in the education system, and so much more as an export industry, because many of the developing countries in Asia, they don't want necessarily to get a whole pile of computer scientists. They need people with some of those quite technical skills.
Guy, do you have a thought on this?
Look, I agree absolutely with what Jennifer's said there, and I think we've got to sort of optimise the post-secondary education system to get the right balance. So we see this in the infrastructure construction market. We're not a constructor, but every conversation I have, whether it was in Adelaide yesterday or anywhere else in the country, is how do we get the right skills to be able to deliver the major projects which are needed to fuel economic growth. And everybody is crying out for skills shortage, and South Australia is going to have to compete very hard with the East Coast and a resources sector that's rebounding to get the skills. Unless we have a system that puts more of these technically skilled workers through and get them job ready, then it's going to stifle economic growth.
I'll just make a point. I think that this is a legacy issue from years of policy decisions which wash through. When you think about post-secondary education, we can look at the German system where you've got apprentices doing associate degrees in parallel and dipping in and out and acquiring skills from a bachelor standpoint, and even going on to become PhDs and qualified engineers. The way in which our system is engineered actually mitigates against that happening. Someone gets enrolled in a program, they get enrolled in a degree. It's almost impossible to acquire a skill in isolation because of the way the framework is structured. It's not like the universities couldn't warrant that you have a skill, but the way in which the funding flows doesn't permit that to happen. When we look at the way in which people want to acquire skills, it is exposure to small chunks of courses, micro-credentials, and the accrual of that. But we can't bestow a qualification. We can say you've acquired a skills level or you've attained a certain amount of expertise. There's a root and branch analysis of how the system is engineered is required, which is what Plibersek will do if she comes in as Minister for Education. That will take a significant amount of time to wash through, and it'll solve the problem in probably 5 to 10 years' time. Right now, a single course enrolment is I would think it's almost a holy grail from a university standpoint, because it's what people need right now for qualifications. TAFE in this jurisdiction had a very interesting ride when it squeezed out private providers, and the way in which it delivers qualifications is anachronistic. But there's a refreshing plan in place to transfer that over, and there'll be a new chief executive in place from next Monday who understands the system. The way in which universities look at sub-bachelor qualification, even the language is prejudicial, is another piece. Universities are in the degree space, and I mean it should be at that qualification level where we can warrant what we're producing is at a certain level. And the pathways, there's very little articulation between TAFE and universities. And apprentices get thrown into this mix as well, so there's no clarity about where people are being educated or how they access the education they need or who's going to accredit what they get when they go out the door. So it is, it's all a function of the way in which funding works, and it's a function of federation and who takes responsibility at a federal level or at a state level. So it's a thorny issue, but it's one that we have to grapple with.
And one very simple thing we could do is the Commonwealth and states could agree not one more cent should come out of bed until we've sorted it out.
There you go. Great question. Do we have one more, perhaps, in the room? One or two more? Yes.
My question is, both sides of government have been talking about opportunity in China for many years. Given the current political environment and investment opportunities, is that still the right market for South Australia to be focused on?
Well, I think we have to seriously look at the threat of China. I have a role working alongside Madeleine Albright's business in the US, and I was in Washington recently with their group of advisors from around the world, and the way all countries are dealing with China at the moment, all democratic countries are dealing with China, really makes it, is it smart, is it sensible to be pursuing that route? And someone like Madeleine is a tremendously big fan of the future of India. I think David can talk, and I'm sure University of Adelaide and others can talk about the growth in the Indian market and elsewhere in higher ed. So I think it's not, we all got very enthused about China, a decade or so ago, and it was going to save us all, and indeed most probably has saved us with the purchase of our resources. But I think, fundamentally that it's not just a business piece that we need to be wary of, it's the security piece, and that's possibly more important in the long term.
Anybody got a counter view or a...
Well, I'm not sure it's a counter view, but I think your question really translates to Australia as much as South Australia. So 23% of our trade is with China, the next biggest is 9% with Japan, so we are hugely leveraged to China. The Australia-US-China trilemma, if you like, is a difficult one for Australia to navigate, but it's got to navigate it, because we don't have a choice of... Trade is 45% of our GDP, so we have no choice but to trade. The mystery is, why have we not been able to grow new markets like India? Peter Varghese did a report for the government recently on that. It's not without its challenges. I know many in business all have a horror story about India and the difficulty of doing business in India. So I think the challenge is not to withdraw from trade with China or even withdraw our disengagement with China, but it is to find, as always, new markets and grow new markets. And clearly India and Indonesia are two huge markets that sit very much on our doorstep, and I think that's probably the better puzzle to solve. How can we increase our share of those markets? I know ANZ, for example, and David might want to comment on this, is one of, actually from my perspective, one of the bigger players in India from an Australian company perspective. Have quite a presence there.
In India's, I completely agree. We should be growing other markets. China, we can't walk away from the relations we have there, but they are fraught with danger, and some of the stories that you come across when you spend time there, quite frightening. the way they go about things, and it's a big cultural step that we've taken to come to terms with that. India, I lived in India for 4 years. I get the opportunity, but I know how difficult it is. It's like 27 different countries in one. It's very difficult to deal with. Corruption is high, we know that. But to find your way around that, there are people and some companies from around the world that have done that very well. I think it's probably got a growth trajectory similar to what we've seen in China if we get it right.
And they've got bankruptcy laws now.
Yeah.
All right. Lastly, one more there. Yes.
Yes, hi, thank you. My question really relates to the big picture, the vision and the branding of South Australia, maybe Australia in general, and I'm not sure whose responsibility that is with all the different chairs moving in politics and what have you, but if I use Germany as an example, brand Germany means something, which means that people know what they get from Germany, people understand what the opportunities are there, and if I use the motor car industry as an example, people tell me that the unlimited speed limits on the Autobahn is actually a statement about promoting German cars. And so there's a cooperation between industry, universities and the government to create this kind of brand. So I don't really see that in Australia or South Australia, but I think the vision and the brand is so important, because that then will drive so many other things about where to put incentives for, whether it's R&D or social structures or the type of education that people should be given. And we in South Australia, and I guess Australia in general, we're a conglomeration of lots of small companies all doing their thing, but I don't see the coordination or the vision or the brand to actually strengthen that. I mean, so
there's
what does the
quite
panel
a
feel about
substantial
that?
piece of work happening at the Commonwealth level on a national brand. Andrew Forrest, one of the great Australians, is chairing that process. Many Australian major corporations are involved in that. So there's certainly a recognition by governments, and this will be something that is, I think, not contested between the two political parties, is that we need like a 100% pure, like the New Zealand brand. But then we have to find a way of making sure that we get not just the state brands, but the regional brands. So if you kind of take New Zealand, for example, they've done this really well. You go the 100% pure, but you know if you buy a Pinot Noir from the Central Otago, you're going to buy a cracking wine. And everyone in the world knows that, well, people who drink wine anyway. So, we've got to be able to not have this as a competition, which is where Australia has got stuck with this. It's a competition rather than a collaboration. This is one area where I think there is serious cross-party support for, let's get a brand, a simple image to the rest of the world, clean, green, safe, secure products, and then we've got to get the state and then the city and regional stuff to be part of that brand. Ian might have something to say.
Ian, an opportunity for South Australia.
Look, you're absolutely spot on in what you say, and everything you say is correct when it comes to the lack of coordination and in fact the worst people to become marketers are politicians, in my view. They to understand brand, it's glib and it's hyperbole, and it's all sort of generally wrong. So I think what we need to do is sort of from a South Australian perspective is understanding actually what we're really good at and promoting that as part of the national picture. I mean, many people, if not everyone in this room, has obviously travelled overseas on business. You're from Australia. Sure, we may be from South Australia or Queensland or wherever else it is, but it's Australia first. But if your region is known, and it goes to Jennifer's point, if we are a cracking state for defence now. We have space happening. I think while we've got fabulous universities, I mean, people were saying, well, we're the education city. Well, in truth, we're not. We're we've got fundamentally good universities, but, Melbourne and Monash, and they're cracking universities too. So let's be real about what we can market ourselves as being truthfully. And truth tends to work in advertising. Hyperbole doesn't. It gets deconstructed pretty quickly.
Well, that's fascinating. All right. I think we'll probably close it there for now. I'm sure the panel, if you want to mingle afterwards, we're all around. But I'd just like to thank, it was just, it's a lot of very, very interesting people, so I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have. Thanks to our panel. Thank you very much.